me. His face fell minutely before he growled in frustration, and flopped into one of the empty seats, slamming his elbows painfully onto the desktop, and dropping his head into his palms.
Fuck.
He cursed in defeat, rubbing his face with his palms, while I stood by the door, uncertain of how to comfort him. I felt the most irrational surge of guilt, that he had to hold his temper back just for my benefit. As if I was being burdensome because he couldn't go pummel that boy like he really wanted to. That was just the reality to the depth of my love for him. I would give him anything to make him happy, and see him smile. I hesitantly shuffled over to the seat, and slowly lifted a hand to his shoulder. And even though his muscles were difficult to feel through his leather jacket, I could tell he was still stiff with anger. I slid my hand up his neck, rubbing soothingly against his skin, and eventually working into his hair and stroking it gently in an attempt to ease him. After a few moments, he huffed into his palms and dropped one hand, bringing it around my waist and guiding me into his lap. I sat sideways on his legs as he finally lifted his head from his other hand and used it to yank my hood off my head.
Sorry.
He grunted, still looking frustrated, but trying to beat it back down. That much I could tell. So I smiled at him and kept caressing his hair, as his angry gaze focused on anything but me. The crease was there in his forehead again as his brows furrowed in annoyance. After a while, he sighed deeply and dropped his forehead to my shoulder, tightening his grip around my waist as his messy hair tickled my ear. We never made it to lunch Wednesday. We sat in the darkened classroom as I made countless attempts at easing his anger with loving caresses. I stroked his hair. I kissed his cheek. I nuzzled his neck. I whispered in his ear that I loved him. I told him an unforgivably crude and tasteless joke about two nuns who walked into a bar. And by the time the bell rang, he was smiling at me again, crease-free. He still looked rather preoccupied when I made it to his room that night. And I was worried that he had spent his evening in his mind again, but was beyond relief that the crease was still absent from his face as I kissed him. Still, I pushed, tugging at his hair and trying to make him so overcome with lust that he would try to touch me again as I shifted against his hips quite intentionally. Of course, Edward couldn't be swayed like that, and I should have known by then that nothing I could have done would have worked on him. That night I felt something else alongside the bitterness and frustration. Defeat. I pathetically wallowed in the bitter depression that the defeat plunged me into. All night, and all day Thursday. It was so stupid. Something so small, and seemingly pointless to any casual observer. It wasn't like I was some sexual deviant, or anything. But the idea that we may never be complete like a real couple bothered me to no end. We could talk, and sleep, and love, and make each other laugh. I was the only thing holding us back from that next level. When I was in the kitchen that night making beef stew, I fantasized the most ridiculous things about Edward and me. I imagined what our first time could be like when he made love to me, and he finally gave me that piece of himself. And I'd give him my virginity, without a second of hesitation, because I already knew I'd always want him, and nothing else. When we became comfortable enough, maybe I'd even get to grant some credibility to those rumors I had heard from Jessica. I dreamed that we'd graduate together and go to the same college, never leaving each other's sides. Maybe we'd have our own home or apartment where we could share the same bed without hiding it, and we'd be able to make love again every night before I hummed him to sleep. Satisfied and euphoric as he held me in his arms, my fantasies became even more ridiculous as I added the vegetables into the beef stew. That one day he'd ask me to marry him, and I'd surely say yes. It was stupid to even consider it, but my mind ran away with me, shoving things in my face that would never come to pass. I'd maybe even finally hunt my real father down so that he could watch our wedding. After my mother had died, they tried to convince me to search for him, even though he didn't know about me. But why seek out someone you'd never be able to live with? Why show him he had to freak for a daughter, one that he could never touch or hug like any normal father would? He'd never be able to walk me down the aisle to a version of Edward that I had conjured and didn't even exist. The bitterness inside me rose, and made my dreams swell, inside my imagination. My brain began cruelly weaving the details into my psyche against my own will. Like how Alice would have to plan the wedding, forcing me into dresses that I hated while I asked her things like, why can't dresses have hoods again? And she'd make me grin like a mad woman when she'd hold up the veil with a wry smile. The elements of the whole fantasy became excruciatingly more vivid, transforming into a relentless vision possessing my thoughts. It was so vivid in fact, I actually snorted into the pot of stew I was cooking when the image came to my mind of the showdown involved when Alice and me refused to allow Edward his gratuitous use of expletives in his wedding vows to me. I'd roll my eyes at them, smirk, and refuse to get married without the expletives. Without my permission, the words rang clearly in my head as Edward would recite them.
For better, or for bullshit, for richer, or if we both end up poor bastard, solemnly swear to shove my foot up the ass of anyone who touches you, to love and to cherish you for fucking ever.
Everyone who didn't know him well enough would gape at us, open-jawed in shock. The people who did would roll their eyes and sigh in exasperation. And we just grin like complete idiots at each other as the minister eyed us indignantly. I'd make a cookie cake just for Edward. Peanut butter promises perhaps. We'd impatiently sneak away without dancing, eager to begin the wedding night. I didn't care where we went to. We'd make love first. Intense and incredible, and filed with our own personal vows as we became bound by pleasure and the ecstasy of our devotion. Then I'd spend the remainder of the night doing the most wicked and devious things to my husband's body. And I'd hum him to sleep, basking in the grin he'd have plastered on his face. And with that final impossible thought, my stew was burned and completely ruined as smoke began rising in suffocating billows. I cursed my overactive imagination as I spooned it into the trash can, watching dismally as the charred black GLOP slid down the white plastic of the trash bag grotesquely. It could have been good. It was such a ridiculous reverie. Edward never even planned a week ahead. He'd never shown an interest in mutual colleges. He'd never even shown an interest in having sex with me, which was probably a good thing considering the possibility was gradually making itself non-existent. I slammed the lid on the trash can angrily and heated up leftovers. I didn't make peanut butter promises that night. I made Brownie drop defeats. And when I climbed up to the balcony and entered Edward's room, I gave him a soft, loving chase kiss. Defeated. I was tired of the rejection and the bitterness that came when he pulled away. So I saved him the trouble and agony of having to do it. Because I knew he didn't want me feeling it. And I was even more tired of making him miserable right along with me. I hated for him to bear my burdens. He already bore enough without my bitterness. The relief was clear on his face when I didn't pull his hair and intentionally stirred his arousal. Though his eyes looked sad. For some reason I couldn't fathom. I did my best to smile more for him, and I knew it made him happy. I told him I loved him before we went to sleep that night. Beating him to the punch before I hummed him to sleep. Refusing to hear his acceptance alongside my own. My bad day was Friday. It went just like every other day that week, walking the halls with Edward and waiting patiently in my seat after class for him so that I could be picked up, like a child. He was still touching me whenever possible with his hands on my arms and neck, and always perfectly innocent. We began lunch like we had been all week. Rosalie and Emmett never did come to our new table. I had expected them to a few times, but they looked reluctant as they remained at the old one alone, wrapped up in each other. Rose didn't like Edward or Jasper, but Emmett would have gone wherever she went. I removed my hood for Edward, and he stroked the back of my neck, while we ate our brownie drop defeats. Alice and Jasper entered the lunchroom looking particularly frisky as they came to the table hand in hand, grinning and chuckling, and basically making me want to slap them both. I knew their expressions well enough by then. They had just returned from a quick round in the janitor's closet. Edward and I watched as they approached the table. I was already feeling the weight of my depression over the defeat, when Jasper moved